Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gebrial, and joining me today is Stephen. Stephen, how are you doing?
I'm all right, Dalia. I was feeling a lot better until I came into this room and was exposed to the human rights violation that is this lighting. And then suddenly I started to feel like I had a bit of allergy. But I am looking forward to doing this show with you tonight.
Coming up tonight, we have an interview with Tryl from More in Common. And the Israeli ambassador is trying to get a BBC documentary on Gaza banned. Hamas has today returned the bodies of 4 deceased Israelis held in Gaza. Coffins containing the remains were carried by Hamas fighters to a stage erected in the cemetery in the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis. The bodies were those of Shiri Bibas, 33, and her sons Ariel and Kafir, who were aged 4 and 9 months at the time of their capture, and 84-year-old Oded Lifshitz. They were then transferred to the Red Cross and transported to Israel. It's the first time that Hamas has returned bodies to Israel in a fragile ceasefire process that's lasted just a month. And in Tel Aviv, gathered Israelis shed tears over what one man described as, quote, the saddest day in Israel since October 7th. Posting online, Israeli President Isaac Herzog said this: agony, pain. There are no words. Our hearts, the hearts of an entire nation, lie in tatters. On behalf of the state of Israel, I bow my head and ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness for not protecting you on that terrible day. Forgiveness for not bringing you home safely. May their memory be a blessing. It may be that Israel's failures went beyond not protecting those whose bodies have been returned today. The Mujahideen Brigades, a small Palestinian militant faction in Gaza, said in November 2023 that Shiri Bibas and her children had been killed in an Israeli airstrike. Also in November, Hamas reportedly offered to return the bodies of Shiri Bibas and her children, along with her husband Yarden, who was released earlier this month. They say Israel refused, calling the offer psychological warfare. Hamas have also previously said that Lifshitz was killed in an Israeli airstrike while he was held in Gaza. According to an Israeli official not authorized to speak to the press, in exchange for the 4 bodies, Israel has agreed to allow heavy machinery into Gaza, allowing Palestinians to unearth the bodies of their own loved ones buried under 50 million tons of rubble. On Saturday, Israel will release 600 Palestinian captives in exchange for 6 living Israeli captives, as well as the 4 bodies transferred to the country today. But Palestinian MP Mustafa Barghouti posted this online, reminding the world that those releases are just a drop in the ocean. Israel continues to withhold, imprison, the corpses of 665 Palestinians who were killed by the Israeli army, including 59 children, 9 women, 67 who died in Israeli prisons, in addition to an unknown number of bodies of Palestinians killed during the last war on Gaza. According to Israeli media, at least 1,500 bodies of Palestinian martyrs from Gaza are held near the Israeli Tamam prison. Many of the corpses have been withheld by Israel since 50 years. Palestinians are equal human beings, and they also have the right to bury their lost sons and daughters in dignity. Saturday's exchange will mark the end of the first phase of the ceasefire after Hamas agreed to accelerate the release of 6 Israeli captives. 59 will remain in Gaza, half of them believed to be dead. But Hamas has offered to accelerate the process, saying this in a statement: we have informed the mediators that Hamas is ready to release all hostages in one batch during the second phase of the agreement, rather than in stages as in the current first phase. These steps reflect the seriousness of Hamas in implementing the terms of the agreement as stated, and in response to the efforts of the mediators. But the peace deal remains incredibly fragile, made more so by US President Donald Trump's announcement of his plan to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. And in Israel, despite the risk it poses to remaining Israeli prisoners alive in Gaza, some are still calling for all-out war. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich posted this on X today: we wake up to a difficult morning for all of us, a morning that sharpens the cruelty of our enemies and the justice of our determined war against them until they are destroyed from the face of the earth. The entire people of Israel embrace the families and the heroic community of Nir Oz and share their deep sorrow. Let not our spirit fail. God and we will avenge their blood and restore the stature of the people of Israel and the state of Israel. Former National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir was even more grotesque, saying this: Remember these moments, the sadness over the shedding of innocent blood, the joy of the beasts of prey, the thirst for blood, the clear knowledge that these Nazis must not continue to live. Our historical duty to our children is not to give up. These Nazis deserve no humanitarian aid, no fuel, no electricity, no trailers, no bulldozers, no ceasefire, no withdrawal. Only the gates of hell. Stephen, what do you make of these updates coming out of Gaza today?
Well, I think the place I want to start, Dalia, is by saying that obviously the deaths of two small children are always something to mourn. Really, really tragic. And these two Bibas children were, really very small when they were captured, and then when they were killed, as Hamas says, by Israeli bombs. But we don't know that. Either way, it is a terrible tragedy. But I want to talk about something else about the scenes that we saw there. So a lot of attention has been paid to the fact that Hamas brought these bodies out onto a stage in coffins and displayed the coffins before handing them over to the Red Cross. Now, one of the things you mentioned in that report is that there's going to be an increase in the number of Israeli captives released this weekend in exchange for bulldozers being allowed into Gaza in order to allow Palestinians to start digging under the rubble to access the bodies of their loved ones. Thousands, potentially tens of thousands of people dead under that rubble. Many of them will have been there for a year or more. Now, when people talk about a lack of dignity for the dead, when you saw those scenes of the coffins, it really makes me think actually of the lack of dignity for the dead that we've seen in Gaza over the last year and a half. And that lack of dignity is only going to become more pronounced as the bodies under the rubble are removed. None of them are going to be afforded the dignity that the remains passed over to the Red Cross today were afforded, even though those coffins were displayed to the public. And I can see the point of saying, look, prisoner exchanges, the return of remains should be done out of the public eye. I can see the point of that. But the fact is that none of the killing that has been done in Gaza has been done outside of the public eye. I mean, we can all remember the scenes from what seems like countless hospital raids where people seeking shelter in those hospitals were frantically burying the bodies of the dead in shallow graves in the grounds of the hospitals, only for, once the raids were complete, Israeli military bulldozers to go over those grave sites, turfing up the bodies for Palestinians to have to then go and pick up again and rebury afterwards. So Palestinians have been afforded, in terms of their dead, none of the dignity that we saw afforded to the remains of the Israeli captives that were returned to Israel today. And not only have they not been afforded any of that dignity, we're not going to see any of that dignity come anytime soon. The UN estimates that to move the 50 million tons of rubble that is all of what remains of most of Gaza will take up to 15 years. We can only imagine the state of bodies that Palestinians are going to have to encounter when they access those bodies over such a lengthy span of time. So, yes, there is a lot to mourn in the deaths of those two boys whose bodies were returned to Israel today. But I think there is also a lot to mourn in terms of the numbers of dead in Palestine, as well as the complete lack of dignity with which those dead have been treated and are likely to be treated in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about being treated with dignity in death and this idea that, it's undignified for bodies to be returned in the public eye, I just cannot help but think about the number of times I have seen Palestinians holding up their dead in plastic bags, in sometimes not even in a plastic bag. I mean, I don't know if you remember that Palestinian father who had a plastic bag and he was saying that like his son was in there. Or I'm thinking about the press conference outside of the hospital where the Palestinians are holding up their dead relatives because they are trying to beg the world to stop this from happening. In what way is that dignified? In what way were Palestinians afforded dignity in burying their dead and mourning their dead when they had to show the corpses of their loved ones to the world in order to beg the world to stop killing them? children having to carry their dead siblings over their shoulders. I mean, it's the humanity that is afforded to one side and the complete dehumanization to the other. I mean, we're kind of repeating ourselves over and over again, but that it is important to highlight that stark difference between the way that Palestinian life and Palestinian death is treated compared to Israeli life and Israeli death, and how you are treated in death is a reflection of how you are valued in life as well. So it's, all kind of demonstrating the same double standard. More in Common have released a new report mapping the political culture of the UK left. The main headline being circulated about the report is that the group they term progressive activists are less likely than their right-wing or centrist counterparts to work with political rivals. The report found that these progressive activists are also likely to hold different attitudes on key issues to the rest of the population. So this infographic shows the different clusters identified by earlier versions of the report, which was published in 2020. So progressive activists there at 13% of the population see politics as the core of their identity and believe in justice for minoritized groups and wealth distribution. Then you have civic pragmatists, also at 13%. These hold similar opinions to progressive activists, but are less engaged and focused in politics. You have disengaged battlers who believe the system is unfair, are socially liberal, but disconnected and disillusioned. Establishment liberals are generally well off and mean well towards others, but see good in the status quo. Then loyal nationals, who are defined as patriotic, tribal, protective, threatened and frustrated about economic inequality. Then disengaged traditionalists are suspicious, value a well-ordered society and strong leadership. And then finally, backbone conservatives at the bottom there, who are patriotic and optimistic about Britain's future outside Europe. So the more recent version of this report does a deep dive into that progressive activist cluster. And the finding that is grabbing the most headlines is the one about who progressive activists would be willing to campaign alongside. So the red represents the percentage of progressive activists who would never be willing to campaign alongside, say, Reform voters or evangelical Christians. Grey represents I don't know, and blue represents the percentage who would be willing to campaign alongside them. Now, the point the report is trying to make is that progressive activists need to be more open and willing to compromise in order to win. And the executive summary sort of summarizes this by saying this. The challenge for progressive activists is that rather than being able to unite other segments of the population with shared antipathy, particularly with the economic settlement in the UK, an expectation of alignment on cultural issues, or a tendency to view the concerns of social conservatives as either bigoted or naive, actively prevents them from doing so. Now, the report did stress that this does not need to come at the expense of principles. It says a different approach does not require progressives or campaigners of any stripe to change their core values, nor should it lessen anger towards injustice or impatience for change. What this research suggests is that a fresh approach in both tone and tactics, plain English that is more welcoming and less absolutist, disruptive or chastising, is more likely to build support for these issues, which progressive activists care about. Now, I think there are some caveats here to the argument that openness or willingness to compromise is a unique problem of progressive activists, because if you go back to the earlier version of the report, which surveyed all the different clusters, that report did not find openness on the right wing of the spectrum, who are arguably winning politically right now. The 2020 version of that report found that 70% of backbone conservatives, loyal nationals, and disengaged traditionalists favour a strongman style of leadership, which they characterise as, quote, commanding leadership with less democratic process, fewer compromises, and a willingness to ignore norms. Also, if we look back at the earlier graphic, which shows who progressive activists are willing to campaign alongside, so it's highlighted here as a problem that a segment of progressive activists are not willing to campaign alongside people who support Israel's right to exist or who voted for reform. And this is particularly highlighted in the report as a shocking fact. Yet it's worth pointing out that the reverse is also true. Believing in Israel's right to exist is a barrier of entry to participation in public life. It's the first question anyone is ever asked when interviewed on the topic. Similarly, being seen to be aligned with the Corbyn project is constantly used to disqualify people from being taken seriously publicly. So, this issue of cancelling those with other views is not unique to progressives or leftists. The right and the centre are extremely dogmatic and rigid in their view of what is and is not acceptable thought. But the difference is that they have the material and political power to enforce these boundaries in a very real but more covert way. And that's not to say that political purity tests are not a problem on the left and don't sometimes get in the way of necessary coalition building. But I wonder if this is a unique problem to the left, or if it's appropriate to blame this for the rise of the far right, which the report authors do. Because to me, what's missing in this report is the question of power. The reason that the right have been able to whip up support for their positions is not because they've been necessarily more or less dogmatic or open in their principles. For decades, the right have been completely dogmatic in their insistence that the only thing we should be talking about is how immigration is a threat to everything we hold dear. And they've labelled anyone who argues otherwise a bleeding heart liberal or a coward or anti-British. They did not shift their position towards us, but shifted us towards their position. Because what the right have that we don't is excessive power and resources that enable them to repeat and transmit their message at a scale we simply can't match. We don't have an equivalent of billionaire-backed outlets like Fox News, The Mail, or The Express who are able to broadcast their version of reality on a huge and daily scale. Now, that doesn't mean that we sit back and accept failure, but it does explain why progressive views on some of these key issues are not dominant. Is it just a question of tone and argumentation style? Or is it the reach and scale that our message can have because our positions do not reflect power? It also certainly means that the worst thing we can do right now is ideologically concede or allow ourselves to be made insecure about our principles by the overwhelming material power that the right currently has. And to me, that has to come from a loving and understanding strength and fighting for justice for everyone, even if we don't agree with everything they believe right now. And the place where I personally see that happening isn't on Twitter or social media, but in movements organizing on the ground in housing, climate, and workplaces. These are the places where we are seeing coalitions being built across demographic and, yes, political lines. Because strength doesn't come from being embarrassed or publicly wavering on our positions, especially when those positions can concern life or death for some of the most marginalized. It comes from holding those positions whilst building meaningful power in the ways that are accessible to us. Now, I put some of these questions to Luke Tryl, who is Executive Director at More in Common, earlier today, and I began by asking him this. The report found that progressive activists hold really different views from the rest of the population on some key issues. I mean, that has arguably been the case throughout a lot of history. I mean, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, these are all groups that at some point held views that did alienate a majority of people, but they eventually won, at least partially, not by conceding, but sometimes by quite militant organizing, which in some cases, again, was initially quite alienating. Is there something different about this generation of progressive activists to those historic examples?
Progressives, I guess, by their nature, have always held outlier views, and that's why they've, in lots of cases, been the engines for driving social progress. And clearly there is nothing wrong with having outlier views. And one of the things we wouldn't want is this report to be saying you must change your views and go in a different direction. Instead, it's more, we start off by looking at those outlier views, but then I guess for me, the more interesting part of the report is why progressives might not be reaching or being able to change minds in the same way that some other campaigns in the past have done. And we found a couple of reasons why that might be the case. And the three which particularly jump out for me were, one, that progressives tend to overestimate the number of people who share their starting point on issues, some of which are pretty central to progressive views around, taking in more refugees into the UK, or, tackling climate change, even if it has trade-offs for the economy. Now, progressive activists don't think a majority of people share their views. It's not that level of overestimation, but it's by a factor of about 2 to 3. And if you are overestimating like that, it can make you feel that perhaps you can skip over some of the persuasion stage and focus on activating the base strategy. So that's one. The second one is we found that there was more of an unwillingness amongst progressives to campaign with people who didn't share a wider set of worldviews. So, for instance, progressive activists, around half wouldn't campaign with someone who voted Conservative on an issue they both agreed on. About 40% wouldn't campaign with someone who was an evangelical Christian. And there were a few other examples like that, which, of course, makes the tent that you're trying to build smaller. And, if you compare that with some historic campaigns, the gay rights movement, for instance, had lots of actors with different perspectives. But one of the reasons that, particularly from, bringing in Section 28 through to equal marriage, that it was able to make so much progress was bringing in perhaps more conservative voices, some religious voices. So that was part of it. And the third area was less of a willingness amongst progressives, perhaps, to debate with others, or to think that some viewpoints are so harmful that they shouldn't be engaged with in debate. Now, I should say on that, Brits do not have American-style free speech fidelity. A majority of Brits think, for instance, someone who denies the Holocaust should be denied a platform, or someone who implies that race is linked to IQ. In previous polling we've done on EDI. But it seems that where progressives draw the line on who they will and won't debate perhaps limits opportunities for them to reach other people as well.
If we are to look at the kind of the counterpart, so the more reform style, the more right wing but highly politically engaged people, so not those disaffected people that you referenced earlier, but that more engaged right wing segment who arguably are kind of winning in many senses right now. Do you find a radically different culture amongst that group? I mean, I don't know if you have done a similar deep dive into those loyal nationalists or those, backbone conservatives. Did you find that they were more willing to be doing those things, to be more willing to be open to building coalition? Because from where I'm standing, I do feel like, if you were to go into a reform conference or party meeting and sort of loudly proclaim that you believe that trans women are women, I mean, could you expect to be welcomed with open arms or debated in a reasonable way? Is there a difference there between the highly engaged progressive group and the highly engaged right wing groups?
So the really interesting thing is that when we initially this segmentation, we actually first released in 2020. And at that time, actually, in the UK, there wasn't really, we couldn't, certainly in big enough numbers, obviously there were people like it, but there wasn't a group, a sort of 8 to 10% group like the progressive activists on the right. Their counterparts were slightly different. So there's a group called Backbone Conservatives, but they're not sort of as engaged. They're not very political. They're more conservative by disposition. And the Loyal National group are interesting in the sense that they are engaged, but they're sort of more disconnected from political debate. So at that time, there wasn't, and so they're a sort of socially conservative, economically left-leaning group. I guess we've come to think of them as sort of like red wall voters. But there wasn't a counterpart. We think now we may be seeing the emergence of an equivalent on the right. And in fact, our next sort of deep dive project is going to be looking at that. And, for instance, whether online echo chambers are, on something like Ukraine, or indeed the debate that happened this week about whether Rishi Sunak was English, whether actually there is an online right group which are moving very far from the mainstream public. So more on that. But within the existing groups that we've looked at, what you tend to find is that the patterns don't quite pertain in a sort of, I guess, a mirror image. So if you look at backbone conservatives, they tend not to underestimate the proportion of people who have socially liberal views. They tend to be about right on. They also tend to have less, I guess, what you might call, in political terms at least, sort of negative views of people on the other side. So, for instance, whereas progressive activists have quite strongly unfavourable views towards, say, those who voted for Brexit overall, backbone conservatives don't have negative views for those who voted for Remain. So it does seem to be a bit asymmetric. But it does, as I say, it does seem like there is a more online right group emerging who we're going to spend a bit more time looking into in the future.
I read the 2020 report, and I did find that in that the three groups that were more towards the right, so, the backbone conservatives, etc., you do list them as generally as really liking this kind of strongman leadership, which is less willing to compromise, which has a kind of more authoritarian bent to it, which doesn't believe that they should be compromising with the other side. And so is it really just a fact that people that we live in increasingly polarized times and that both sides are kind of sharing this similar suspicion of the other side?
It is definitely the case that those groups, particularly you mentioned the disengaged traditionalists, when it comes to a democracy, they are more likely to say we do just need to sort of get things done. I think that results less from a sort of unwillingness to engage with the other side, and more we just need to sort of get on with things. There is a sort of urgency that things are being thrown in our way. Now that might have other quite problematic outcomes. If, for instance, you don't believe that, use an example like the rule of law is an essential sort of tenet. So it's not to say, and again, the report is very clear that there are that this isn't just something which progressives are driving. But I guess what I come back to is that progressive activists are, when we, if you do a survey of people who form a campaign team in a charity or a policy and an advocacy team in a charity, they're dominated by progressive activists. They are people who, I guess, they see their job as winning people over to their cause. And so sort of more reflection on the reasons why they might not be reaching those groups, I think, is quite important, and particularly important if you're in that kind of role. Whereas it tends to be that backbone conservatives, loyal nationals, are in less small p political environments, particularly in the workplace.
I guess if we're kind of looking forward, both the 2020 and the 2024 reports say that there is fertile ground for shared understanding amongst progressive activists and other political sections of the British public. To you, what is the key terrain on which these coalitions can be built?
Progressive activist starting points on lots of economic questions are really not that far away from the median voter. In fact, on lots of the questions around higher tax for the rich, on nationalisation, they're actually closest to the loyal nationals, who are that more socially conservative group. So there's definitely something there. And I guess one of the things that we don't say in the report, but we'd like to explore more, is to what extent can, if progressive activists work with more allies who might disagree with them on cultural issues, make progress on those areas that you might, sort of categorize as economic, inequality or more redistributive politics. So I think that's one. But I think the second thing to say is, look, within the report, we look at the social issues where, progressive activists tend to be outliers. What that doesn't mean is that the British public takes a sort of, is entirely in the other direction. It's just, very often this is a matter of degree. So, for instance, across segments of the population, there is a sort of recognition that Britain has a role in supporting those people who feel persecuted, who have been persecuted abroad, and taking in refugees. There's a recognition that migration adds in a lot of areas as well. So, it is about recognizing that even on those cultural issues where progressive activists' starting points might be outliers because they are more, and I don't say it's pejorative, but they're more in a more extreme direction, doesn't mean that the whole of the British public are the way, that you can probably meet people halfway. And that in lots, and I don't mean that in a sort of soggy centrist way, I mean that there is if there's a guiding principle that we find from our focus groups and work with the British public, it is, a belief in decency, fairness, doing the right thing. And I think the more that progressives can lean into that, the more they're going to be able to build these bigger tents.
So when you come to a question like, for example, like immigration, the right of people to seek asylum in this country, or people whose countries have been underdeveloped by our global economic system, seeking a better economic opportunity in this country, etc. There's this sense of, we might try and make this positive case and make this case that actually, the world is deeply unfair and you should not be blaming immigrants for the injustices in the world, that, all of these things. We make these cases and we make these arguments. And what happens is that the weight of the right, whose success doesn't just lie in them having a more effective tone or a more open disposition, but rather in the fact that they essentially have their view is very heavily represented in the media. We don't have an equivalent of Fox News. We don't have an equivalent of the Daily Mail that can broadcast our vision of the world over and over and over again at a huge scale. And so what does it look like to be able to hold those core values very deeply, which, yes, they are cultural issues, but they are also an issue of people's, of life and death, of people's inherent, rights as human beings. What does it actually look like to be able to do that convincing work when you are faced by overwhelming power on the right, and when there's this real urgency that the longer that this toxic debate is allowed to continue, the harsher the consequences are going to be on people who are already underrepresented?
That urgency and import places an even greater premium on the areas that the report looks at. And obviously the report, there's much more beyond this report, and there are much more experienced people in campaigning than us. So we don't claim to be the only experts, but I think it places an urgency on thinking around, how do we build those big tents, particularly if there is an ecosystem on the other side opposed to it that makes that difficult. So, for instance, I use that example of campaign. 40% of progressive activists wouldn't campaign alongside an evangelical Christian. Actually, on something like immigration and refugees, evangelical Christians can be some of the strongest allies, and it ends up sort of narrowing the tent if there's an unwillingness to work with groups like that. I think, secondly, part of it is that sometimes we find that the language that is used is off-putting as well. And I think you can use different language without changing your, fundamental principles. So, for instance, one of the things that we tested in the report is language around phrases like white privilege. Now, if you use the phrase white privilege, you basically progressive activists are the only segment who support that frame. If you ask, do people from ethnic minority communities suffer discrimination that white people don't, you get majority support. Now, clearly, the privilege frame is designed to communicate something. But what's interesting is when we've talked about in focus groups, you get, very often people say, well, I haven't had privilege in my life. And it's actively sort of repelling them from a principle that they might otherwise support. So I think, thinking about the use of language. And I think there's a third thing, which is, and this, what I'm not saying is there should be, is that people should sit back and accept a sort of blanket right to be offensive. But I think there have been times, I think the report shows it, so progressive activists are the only group who think that when someone makes a mistake on diversity issues, that it's more helpful than not to criticize them for it. I think there have been times in some of these debates where progressive activists' response, when sometimes it's been bad faith, but other times it's been sort of well-meaning questions. I would say, for instance, in debates around gender identity, trans, sex-based rights, the response from progressive activists has been so much in that tone of sort of criticism and chastisement that it's actually pushed people further in the other direction, and that people who started off as kind of agnostic have ended up becoming sort of actively opposed as well to it. So I think they're the things. And then there's a debate to be had on, I guess, the fourth issue, which is around what we also have found is that progressive activists, sort of central actually to their worldview is a sense of urgency, not just about what's happening in the UK, but what's happening globally. That can occasionally mean that progressive activists skip over the phase of celebrating progress. So, something like climate, we've actually gone quite there's loads more to do if you want to transition to net zero, but a lot of progress has been made, and the danger of not celebrating progress is that people think there's no point, that we haven't done anything at all. So I think they're things that progressives could perhaps look at, particularly progressive campaigners could look at doing, which don't involve compromising on core principles, and could at least build a larger counterweight to those on the other side of the debate.
One thing that the left don't do enough is position ourselves as the winners of history. I mean, I think that we are broadly the winners of history in many senses, not in a lot of other senses, but to make people feel like, you are on the winning side. When we look at questions around racial justice, when we look at questions around gender and sexuality and all of these things, historically, it is the progressive activists who have been proven right many times. I guess on the question of the trans issue, where I would push back a little bit here is ultimately, if we think about public media, you can't really it's very difficult to name a trans person who is routinely invited onto political news shows, who is routinely represented in political debates, and is not there essentially to be humiliated or chastised. Whereas the voices of people who want to stigmatize trans people is very, very overemphasized. It's even though it's presented as the marginalized voice, it's actually very much the boosted voice. And so my question is, if you look at how some people start, my mum is an example. There's someone who might start agnostic and then gets pushed into a particular position, an anti-trans position. That's not where my mum is. She kind of flits around a bit, but gets pushed into an anti-trans position. How can we concretely say that it is the responsibility for that lies on defenders of trans people who maybe are combative or who are dogmatic in their approach, versus the fact that anti-trans voices have been so heavily inflated in our media and been given so much weight, and in many ways been portrayed as the underdog voice when in fact they are the mainstream voice? How can we concretely say that it is because trans movements have alienated those people rather than those people have been organized into their positions by anti-trans people who have a much more inflated political voice in our media and in our political establishment?
Part of it will be the campaign on one side, part of it will be the actions of the campaign on the other side. And it is difficult, it's difficult to put numbers to precisely what is causing, particular attitudes to shift. What is interesting, though, is when we have done, the debate around trans and sex-based rights is something that we've done a lot of focus groups on, is that people, when people start in a focus group, they almost always, even amongst the more socially conservative groups, in fact, sometimes more so, start from a sort of position of decency. Almost always the first comment is it must be really hard for people who are trans. And then they will move on to, and I have these specific worries, and they won't surprise viewers. The things which tend to come up in focus groups, I know the polling, are around sport and young people in particular. And what it can seem, what was interesting was when we did the last series of focus groups on this, we started one of the focus groups by, rather than talking about people's general experience, or general attitudes towards trans people, we started the focus group by talking about sport and female-only sport. And the tenor of the entire conversation as a result of that was totally different. People were much more kind of hostile is the wrong word, much more concerned, and saw it much more as a threat than they did in some of the other conversations. They saw it much more in that way, and so I think that has been part of it. Some of the campaigning around issues of sex, sex-based rights, transgender, has seemed to come from a more maximalist position, that it must be everything. Whereas if you look at something like gay rights, it was a very much a sort of frustrating though this pace of change may be an occasion. It was age of consent, military, civil partnerships, adoption, Equality Act, equal marriage. It felt like it was taking people on more of a journey than some of these ways. And I do think, just to go back to what you said, I do think the no debate position, which I think has largely been dropped now, but during the early years when more organisations were focusing on this, did limit opportunities to reach people, because it essentially seeded, we talked about those on the right dominant. Sorry, the right and left is wrong for this debate. Those with more gender critical views dominating spaces, but part of that was because a no debate policy meant that the ground was conceded almost from the off.
That does kind of come back to my point, because the trans people in sports angle of the debate did not come from the trans movement. It came from the right wing. It was the right wing taking a very specific, the same thing with trans people in prison and things like this. It was them that made that the starting point of the argument, in order to kind of create a wedge issue out of what is a very, very minor thing that really is going to materially impact like such a tiny population, just elite athletes, basically. What the trans movement has always focused on is, and what their starting point was, is things like adequate access to healthcare, adequate access to housing, being able to have your ID reflect your gender. Those are the issues. And those are issues, having things like more freely available social housing, having a better funded healthcare service that really takes its time and addresses people's concerns and is well resourced. And, having a political ideology that says my entire identity and my entire ability to exist in society, the way that I want to exist in society, should not be defined by the sexual organs that I'm born with. That's actually something that I think that affects a lot of people, and is something that, if we take it on board, would make everyone's life better. Everyone's life would be improved by social housing. Everyone's life would be improved by better funded healthcare. Everybody's lives would be improved by having less strict boundaries on what you should do depending on the gender that you're identified with. So it was actually the right that introduced the question of sports and things like this directly into the landscape, which tells me that the toxicity of the debate is actually a result of what the right have brought into the room, and the way that the right have framed it and have been able to signal boost their message into everyone's phone, television, newspaper. That is actually where the toxicity is coming from, rather than the trans movement, who have actually been arguing for things that I think holistically would make everyone's life better and speak to a lot of the issues that people care about, like housing, healthcare, etc.
On issues around, particularly around sort of access to healthcare, again, there is sort of strong public support for lots of those issues, but it did seem, I would perhaps challenge that that was the sort of focus, if you look at the sort of period from sort of 2016 to 2020, 2022, because particularly after the publication of the Select Committee report, the view appeared to be from lots of organizations campaigning in this space that it was self-ID or nothing, and if you didn't accept self-ID, there was no scope to work on some of the other issues. Whereas I actually sort of agree. I think if lots of the campaigning organizations had started from the perspective of this is about access to healthcare and treatment, make sure that it's working right, I actually think that, I mean, again, you can't quantify this, but I think it would have been a way in which would have built more resilient public sympathy over the long term. And it is, it is striking that at the time when activism on trans issues has been at its strongest, if you look at something like the British Social Attitudes Survey, sort of support even for things which have been sort of established previously, people's right to change their legal gender, have actually fallen quite significantly. So I think, I would argue that perhaps taking that maximalist approach actually made it harder to build that bigger tent.
Good morning. You all right?
My name is Abdullah. I'm 13 years old. I'm stuck here in Gaza. Have you ever wondered what you'd do if your world was destroyed? Could you live in a tent? Raise your baby? Would you help people? Would you try and have some fun? Most important, could you stay alive? After all this, you could say we're experts. So let me tell you our story. Who knows? One day you might need it.
That was a clip from the BBC documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. And as you saw there, it's fronted by Abdallah Al-Yazouri, a now 14-year-old Palestinian boy from Gaza. It also features 3 other young people detailing the ways they're surviving Israel's genocidal assault on the enclave. There's Renad, a 10-year-old who kept herself occupied after Gaza's schools were closed by starting a TikTok cookery channel with her sister, showing her followers how she prepares meals on a gas-fueled camping stove while bombs fall nearby. 11-year-old Zakaria was separated from his parents, living at Al-Aqsa Hospital at the time Gaza's only functioning hospital. He worked as a fixer and volunteer for ambulance crews, medics and journalists. It's a role that meant he was exposed to an immense amount of bloodshed, with one paramedic saying he thought it was unlikely Zakaria would ever be able to fit in with children his own age as a result. Then there's Rana, a young mother who found herself pregnant in a war zone after leaving her abusive husband. She wants to live alone with her child, but has to survive displacement and Israel's raids on her neighborhood first. The documentary doesn't only focus on children who are somehow managing to survive the war unharmed. This is one of its more harrowing scenes, and I should warn you that some may find it difficult viewing.
يومين استهداف كانت مدرسة هو طب يعني ايديه تقريبا مبتورة 90%. العمليات واحد يقدر يسويها. علي أنا نفسي تحترق. My only consolation from all of this is that he perks up afterwards and becomes a bright little boy again.
For those listening on the podcast, that was a scene of a surgeon trying to save the arm of a 10-year-old Palestinian boy hit by a bomb targeting a school. In one scene we can't show on YouTube, the surgeon holds up the child's amputated arm. The documentary is absolutely unflinching in showing the scenes of suffering inside Gaza. But it's also deeply humanizing, showing scenes of hopeful and joyful children like Zakaria enjoying a day at the beach, a break from his grim duties at the hospital. Or Rania watching Iranian missiles falling towards Israel. She describes the scene as unsettling, but says she's grateful that for once the bombs aren't falling on them. Now, that humanizing portrayal of Gaza's children, as well as the sometimes shocking starkness of the documentary's images of destruction, is extremely affecting. And perhaps that's why a group of people are now attacking the BBC and trying to have the documentary taken down. It began with a report from an online researcher alleging that the documentary's narrator, young Abdallah, is the son of Gaza's Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Ayman al-Yazuri. If that's true, then Abdallah is the son of someone who is a senior member of Hamas's political wing. Now, you might wonder, so what? The political wing of Hamas, which is separate from the armed wing known as the Qassam Brigades, is the civil authority in the enclave, and we rely on it for an immense amount of information. Everything from the Palestinian death toll in Gaza to reports of water and food shortages, hospital updates, and data on all aspects of civilian infrastructure during the assault on the enclave. And why do we rely on it? Because Israel won't allow any independent observers and journalists into the region. If we didn't have the Hamas civilian infrastructure in Gaza, we'd only ever hear Israel's side of the story. Now, that connection between 14-year-old Abdallah and Gaza's civic administration was enough to prompt a group of 45 Jewish media figures to pen an open letter criticizing the BBC for airing it. This is from The Independent. In their letter to the BBC, the group asked, was it known to the BBC that the narrator and principal contributor of the documentary, Abdallah al-Yazuri, is the son of a senior leader of the proscribed terrorist group Hamas? If the BBC was aware that Abdallah al-Yazuri was the son of a terrorist leader, why was this not disclosed to the audience during the programme? If the BBC was not aware that Abdallah al-Yazuri was the son of a terrorist leader, what diligence checks were undertaken and why did they fail? Now, you'll notice that they're calling Abdullah's father a senior leader of the proscribed terrorist group Hamas there. That's because the political wing of Hamas is proscribed by the British government. But obviously, the effect of that is to conflate that organisation, which every journalist in the world reporting on this war relies on for information, with the Qassam Brigades. Also chipping in, unsurprisingly, was Israel's ambassador to the UK, who posted this on X. Following the release of the BBC Two documentary in Gaza, I have sent an official letter to the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie. I asked for clarification on the BBC's choice of cameraman, as well as the main protagonist of the documentary, given the BBC's supposed commitment to impartiality. I await his response. Such a shock to see an Israeli political figure trying to stem the flow of information from inside Gaza. And she mentions the cameramen there. What were their crimes? Well, firstly, they are Palestinians in Gaza, and one of them is also alleged to have posted online praising the October 7th attack on Israel with an emoji. In the original broadcast, the BBC didn't alert viewers to Abdullah's father's job. The BBC have now changed this in response to complaints. This graphic clarifying that connection now appears at the very beginning of the programme. It also stresses that the BBC's production team had full editorial control over the filming of the documentary. And it's worth mentioning that the BBC has not taken such swift action when multiple reports have come out showing that when Palestinians are killed by Israelis, they don't name who killed them. There's a very distinct approach to how the murder of Palestinians by Israelis is reported on as, passive versus when Israelis are murdered by Palestinians, where it's described in very active terms and they name the perpetrator. The BBC were not as quick to rectify that. But now, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has been dragged into this row too. She's promised to discuss the programme with the BBC's Director General. She was asked about the row by LBC's Nick Ferrari.
This is a conversation I'll definitely be having with the BBC.
So you haven't raised it yet with the Director General, the Chairman, this documentary?
Not this specific documentary. I watched it last night. It's something that I will be discussing with them, particularly around the way in which they sourced the people who were featured in the programme. These things are difficult, and I do want to acknowledge that for the BBC, they take more care than most broadcasters in terms of the way that they try to portray these things. They've been attacked for being too pro-Gaza, they've been attacked for being anti-Gaza, but it is absolutely essential that we get this right.
Stephen, do you find those critiques of the documentary convincing?
Not at all, not even in the slightest. If you watch that documentary, Abdullah, who narrates it, doesn't really provide much in the way of information about what's going on in Gaza. He just sort of goes around and introduces characters and talks a bit about what's happened to him. But actually what speaks for itself are the images that constitute the documentary as a whole, as well as the narratives of the other children involved. Especially, I have to say, the story of Zachariah, the little boy who is helping out the ambulances and who, you can just see sort of very casually washing blood off of stretchers, that is itself a striking image without any narration by Abdullah, the son of a Hamas civil government official. So, I think it's very obvious what's going on here. It's just these people are, the group have written this letter, as well as the Israeli ambassador. They're just looking for any way to discredit what is in fact actually an amazing documentary, where the BBC has managed to get amazing access, which would otherwise be completely impossible, to the inside of Gaza during a war, because they've employed Gazan cameramen and because they found a young boy who is willing and able to make this documentary. And was Abdullah encouraged to do it? I'm sure he was. It's in everyone's interest in Gaza to get the story of what is happening there out. Now, the reason that this has turned into a row, and this just brings me on to a different topic, is the BBC's obsession with impartiality. So the BBC is constantly hamstrung by its own commitment to this notion of impartiality. And there's never really a lot of question about why should it care about impartiality? I mean, it's almost like the thought is something like, oh, well, if you get enough of both sides, you'll eventually kind of arrive at reality. But, guess what? Reality is pretty partial. Reality is often very different from what one side is saying versus what another side is saying. And often it's the case that, as you said in an earlier piece, Dalia, that the power that you have means that it's so much easier to sort of convey the version of reality to an audience that you want to convey, and so much harder for another side to do it. So, yeah, I think the idea of impartiality constantly hamstrings the BBC, and it becomes a sort of distraction where this documentary can actually now start to look like it's being discredited simply because someone is making an accusation. Not that it's saying anything false. No one would dare to say, oh, well, what you're seeing there is not what's happening in Gaza. When that surgeon holds up the amputated arm of a 10-year-old boy, that didn't really happen. That's not what anyone is saying, because they can't say that, because they know that exactly that did happen. What they're saying instead is that the documentary should be brought down. That audiences should be deprived of the chance to see it, because the BBC has failed to be impartial. It's failed to, as it were, reflect both sides of what's going on, because in not sort of banning somebody with a connection to the Hamas civilian infrastructure in Gaza from appearing in a major role in the documentary, it's violated impartiality because it hasn't, for example, had an Israeli sort of saying, their side of the story. So yeah, I think it's really the BBC's obsessive commitment to impartiality, which actually I think makes the news often misleading, which has hamstrung it in this case, which has made it the case that people are able to attack it over what is in fact an excellent truth-telling documentary about the situation inside Gaza at the moment.
Yeah, and I think the point is that the thresholds for innocence, the threshold for reliability, the threshold to be seen as neutral for Palestinians is radically different to that of Israelis. Palestinians are not seen as reliable narrators of their own lives. They're not seen as reliable narrators of the political situation, even though they are living it. And if you live in a place where the government, where are you saying that the only way that a Palestinian is allowed to is allowed to represent themselves, or is allowed to represent what they're going through? The only way that they can do that is if they have absolutely no relationship to the entity that is governing them. I mean, that's not a standard that we would hold anyone by. It's again that kind of that threshold that Palestinians have to meet to be taken seriously, and even then, they're not taken seriously as narrators of their own condition. So, thank you so much for joining me, Stephen.
Thanks very much for having me, Dalia.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Please come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.